The summer heat in Macon County, Alabama, pressed down like iron on the morning of July 14, 1957. On the courthouse steps in Tuskegee, a crowd had gathered, some out of curiosity, some out of obligation, and some because they had come to make sure a thing got done that they believed needed doing. A man stood at the center of it all, his hands at his sides, his jaw set hard, watching the world take from him everything his family had built across 3 generations. Nobody in that crowd expected what was coming. Nobody could have predicted that a single man, a stranger, an outsider, someone with absolutely no obligation to be there, would change the course of that morning entirely. The question is, who was he and why did he do it? His name was Elijah Tarver, and he was 61 years old the morning they came for his land. He had been born on that same soil in 1896, in a one-room house that his father, Thomas Tarver, had built with his own hands after the Civil War had turned the world upside down and set a people loose into an uncertain freedom. Thomas had scratched and clawed and worked himself hollow to purchase 140 acres of farmland in Macon County. Red clay earth, good for cotton, good for corn, carrying the kind of quiet dignity that only a man who once owned nothing could truly understand. He passed that land to his son Elijah, who farmed it with his wife, Clara, and raised 4 children on it, watching them grow up with dirt under their fingernails and pride in their eyes. But the years after the Second World War had not been kind to black landowners in Alabama. The pressures were relentless and came from every direction at once. There were white landowners and county officials who wanted that acreage consolidated into larger holdings. There were predatory loan officers who extended credit at impossible terms, knowing full well that a bad harvest or a sick season could bring a man to his knees. And in Macon County in the mid-1950s, there were men who used the full weight of local government, tax assessments, zoning decisions, debt collection as instruments of dispossession rather than governance. Elijah had taken out a loan in 1952 against the farm to cover medical costs after Clara had fallen gravely ill. She had recovered, thank God, but the debt had not gone away. By 1956, the note had been bought by a private lending firm out of Montgomery, with close ties to a consortium of white landholders who had been quietly assembling large tracts across the county. The terms were called in early, faster than any reasonable man could satisfy them, and when Elijah could not produce the full sum by the deadline, the machinery of the law began to grind. By July of 1957, Elijah Tarver owed $1,400. It was not a catastrophic sum by many standards, but in the arithmetic of that place and that time, for a black farmer with no political allies and no one willing to give him a fair refinancing, it might as well have been a mountain. He had gone to 3 banks. He had spoken to 2 lawyers. He had written a letter to the county tax assessor that was never answered. And now he stood on the courthouse steps of Tuskegee, watching a sheriff's deputy read aloud the terms of a forced public auction for the land his grandfather had bled for. Clara stood beside him, holding his arm, not crying. She had moved past crying into something harder and quieter. Their son, James, 28 years old, and recently returned from 2 years working in Detroit, stood just behind his father with his hands clasped in front of him. The bidding was about to begin. The men who wanted that land were already in position, already wearing small, satisfied expressions. Elijah looked out across the red clay fields he had known all his life and understood with a sinking, terrible clarity that this was the end of something that could never be rebuilt. Some losses cut so deep they don't just take what you have, they take what you were. Nobody noticed the big man at first. He had arrived in Tuskegee the previous evening, driving himself in a rented car from Birmingham, where he had been on a brief personal trip. No cameras, no entourage, no studio representatives. He had taken a room at a small boarding house on the edge of town, run by a woman named Mrs. Delors Pitts, who later recalled that he had been polite and quiet and had eaten his supper without fuss. He was tall, exceptionally tall, with broad shoulders and a way of occupying a room that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with a kind of settled, natural authority. His face was weathered in the way that outdoor men's faces get weathered, lined with sun and years, and there was something about the set of his eyes, a steadiness, a watchfulness that made people instinctively pay attention to him without quite knowing why. He had heard about the auction through a roundabout chain of conversation. A black man named Reverend Curtis Webb, who ran a small Baptist congregation outside Tuskegee, had been speaking with a white attorney from Birmingham at a civic meeting 3 days earlier, speaking loudly and in grief about what was happening to Elijah Tarver and what it represented for black land ownership in Macon County. The attorney had relayed the story in passing to someone else, and that someone else had relayed it to the big man over dinner in Birmingham. He had listened without interrupting. He had asked 2 questions. How much was the debt and when was the auction? Then he had gone quiet and finished his meal. He showed up at the courthouse steps on the morning of July 14th, dressed simply. Dark trousers, a light shirt, a hat pulled low against the Alabama sun. He stood toward the back of the crowd, slightly apart from others, watching. He watched the way Elijah Tarver stood. He watched the way the bidding consortium arranged themselves with the casual confidence of men who already knew how the morning was going to end. He watched Clara's face. He watched James's hands. And something in him, something that those who knew him well would have recognized immediately as the particular moral compass of a man who had decided, went perfectly, quietly still. The deputy began to read the auction terms. The crowd shifted. The morning moved forward like a wheel rolling downhill, and the big man in the back said nothing, gave nothing away, and waited. The bidding opened at $800, and the consortium moved quickly and cleanly, the way men move when they have planned something in advance. A bid of $900, $1,000, $1,100. Elijah stood without flinching, though the colour had drained from Clara's face, and James had put his hand on his father's shoulder. The crowd watched with the discomfort of people witnessing an injustice they feel helpless to stop. A few of the black men and women gathered there had scraped together small amounts. 2 men had quietly pooled their resources to bid if they could, though they both knew it would not be enough against organised money. The bidding passed $1,200, and the consortium's representative, a compact, self-satisfied man in a white linen suit named Raymond Hollis, looked entirely relaxed. And then a voice came from the back of the crowd, calm, deep, unhurried. $1,400. Heads turned. People stepped aside. The big man moved through the crowd without pushing anyone, just stepping forward steadily until he was visible to the deputy conducting the auction. Marion Morrison, known to the entire world by another name, a name that at that moment he had no interest in deploying, stood in the Alabama sun and looked at Raymond Hollis with an expression that contained absolutely no hostility and absolutely no apology. Hollis studied him for a moment. $1,500, Hollis said, and the voice from the big man came back immediately. $1,600, $1,700 from Hollis. Cool. Almost bored, as if this were a minor inconvenience. $1,800 from the big man, still unhurried, still steady. The crowd was completely silent now. $1,900 from Hollis, and a thin smile appeared on his face, the smile of a man who believes money is inexhaustible on his side and limited on the other. $2,000, said the big man. A pause. Hollis conferred with a colleague in a whispered exchange that went on for 30 seconds. Then $2,100, $2,200 from the big man, as calm as if he were ordering breakfast. $2,300, and now there was an edge in Hollis's voice, the first crack in the performance. $2,500, said the big man, and skipped the interval deliberately. And the message in that skip was understood by everyone present. This was not a man who was running out. This was not a man who was afraid of where this went. Hollis looked at him for a long moment, looked at his colleague, looked at the deputy, and then, quietly, without ceremony, declined to bid further. The deputy struck the board. The land belonged to the big man. Elijah Tarver stood very still for a moment, and then turned to look at the stranger who had just outbid everyone in the room. What happened in the minutes after the gavel fell was remembered differently by different people who were there. Mrs. Clara Tarver, in an interview given many years later, said that her first reaction was not relief but bewilderment, a deep, almost disorienting confusion about what had just occurred and what it meant. Her son James said he felt a surge of something he couldn't name, something between gratitude and a protective wariness, because in his experience, gifts from strangers always came with weight attached, and a black family in Alabama in 1957 had learned to be careful about what it owed and to whom. But what happened next settled those concerns immediately and permanently. The big man walked over to the deputy, signed what needed to be signed, and then walked directly to Elijah Tarver. He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and produced a folded piece of paper, a deed transfer, already prepared, drafted the previous evening by a Birmingham attorney he had telephoned after dinner. He held it out. Elijah looked at it and then looked up at the man's face. The paper transferred the title of the 140 acres back to Elijah Tarver outright, free and clear, with no debt, no condition, no obligation attached. Reverend Curtis Webb, who had pushed to the front of the crowd by this point, later recalled that a sound went through the people gathered there, not a cheer exactly, more like a collective exhale, a release of something that had been held too long and too tight. Several women were crying. James Tarver pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and looked away. Clara Tarver, who had not cried through any of it, began to cry now. Raymond Hollis and his colleague left without speaking. The linen suit moved through the dispersing crowd and disappeared, and the mourning carried on. The big man stayed only a few minutes longer. He spoke quietly with Reverend Webb, shook the Reverend's hand, declined an invitation to lunch. He tipped his hat to Clara. He shook James's hand. Witnesses would later say that his face throughout all of it, through the bidding, through the signing, through the transfer, had carried the same expression it had worn when he first stepped forward from the back of that crowd. Utterly composed, completely without performance, like a man who had done a thing that needed doing and felt no need to make anything more of it than that. He walked back through the Tuskegee courthouse square to his rented car and drove away. John Wayne never spoke publicly about what he did in Tuskegee on July 14, 1957. He did not mention it in interviews. He did not include it in the accounts of his life that circulated during his years as America's defining cinematic cowboy. The men and women of his professional world, the directors, producers and studio heads who knew him well, were largely unaware it had happened. It existed for many years, only in the memory of the people who had been there, and in a few handwritten letters that passed between members of the Tarver family and Reverend Curtis Webb over the following decade. This silence was not humility in the performed, strategic sense. It was something more fundamental than that. John Wayne had built an entire public identity around a particular vision of American manhood, the man who rode into trouble, faced it squarely, and rode out again. What he did in that Alabama courthouse square was, in the most essential sense, exactly that. But he understood, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him, that the moment he made it a story about himself, it ceased to be what it actually was. It would become an anecdote, a promotional item, a piece of the John Wayne mythology. And the moment that happened, the meaning would drain out of it. Elijah Tarver farmed that land for another 11 years before age, and health led him to pass it to James. He died in 1973 at 77 years old, on the property his father had purchased after the Civil War, on land that the state of Alabama and the machinery of debt had tried to take from him and failed. James Tarver raised his own children on that land. The family remained. There is one moment from that July morning that those present remembered most clearly above all others. Just before he turned to leave, John Wayne paused beside Elijah Tarver, and the two men stood briefly together without speaking. And then Elijah Tarver looked at him and said quietly, only loud enough for the two of them to hear, "Why?" And the big man looked back at him, and then out across the courthouse square, across the red clay landscape of Macon County, at something that maybe only he could see, and said nothing at all. Because some answers are not in the words. Some answers are in the standing there, in the showing up, in the reaching into your pocket and doing the thing that justice requires of you, whether or not anyone will ever know your name. That is what he left behind in Tuskegee. Not a legend, not a story for a press release, just a family on their land, and the quiet, permanent fact of what one man had chosen to do with his power on a hot July morning, when it would have been so much easier to simply drive on by. There is something this story asks of all of us that goes well beyond the facts of it. It asks us to think about what we do with our advantages when we are standing in the presence of someone else's injustice. John Wayne could have driven past Tuskegee. He could have heard that story over dinner in Birmingham and shaken his head and moved on, the way most people move on from stories of injustice that do not directly touch them. He had no legal obligation, no professional incentive, no social pressure that required him to spend $2,500 of his own money to restore a black farmer's land in Alabama in 1957. He did it because he decided it was right. He did it quietly, he did it completely, and then he left. We live in an age that rewards loudness, that values the documented gesture and the visible act of virtue. What John Wayne did in Tuskegee was the opposite of that. It was a private act of public decency, a thing done not for credit, but for conscience. It is a reminder that character, in its truest form, is what you do when no one is building a story around it. So here is the question worth sitting with today. If you had been standing at the back of that crowd on a July morning in Alabama and you had the power to change what was happening, would you have stepped forward? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, and the people who carried them deserve to be honored.